He pushed the rusted door open, and the room smelled of oil and old coffee, warm and sharp. Dust motes turned in the shaft of late light. A small face, swollen and dark at the jaw, looked up from beneath a hood that had seen better days. He said 2 words that made the chatter in the garage stop. "Can I work here?" The sentence landed like a request and a contract both. It wasn't begging. It wasn't a complaint. It was a choice laid down in plain English. Give me something honest to do, and I'll show up. For a beat, nobody moved. Jackets hung on hooks like a city skyline. Boots scuffed the concrete. A radio answered with the low rumble of an engine. Keller, who kept the books and the peace, squinted from behind a stack of invoices and a mug rimmed with grease. Lucky, a man with wrench hands and a laugh that lived in the back of his throat, gave the boy a slow once-over with a mechanic's appraisal. Posture, hands, shoes. Moose Joe, wide-shouldered, slow-speaking, the one who held the loft keys, raised his eyebrows and tilted the coffee cup. "Where'd you come from, kid?" Keller asked finally, the question less menace than measure. The boy, Noah Collins, if one of them were naming him inwardly, didn't flinch at the attention. He met Keller's eye and answered the only way he could afford to. "I can sweep, I can sort, I can grease." He lifted his hand and showed a bruise near his temple in a motion that was practical, explanatory, not theatrical. It was as if he were listing skills on a konig rather than revealing a wound. Lucky grunted. "We don't take charity," he said, but the tone wasn't cruel. It was a line. The club had rules the size of timber pranks. You earn your keep, you don't make promises you can't keep, and you don't bring chaos inside. You earn it, or you don't get it. Noah nodded. He had been practicing that nod for weeks, in mirrors, on stoops. He could survive on a list. He could be useful. He wanted the dignity of work. Moose Joe crossed the room and put his palm on the boy's shoulder with the kind of weight that steadied more than it pressed. "You stay the night upstairs," he said. "You wake at 6. You sweep, you sort bolts. You don't ask for handouts. You don't cause trouble." No one asked Noah to tell his story. He didn't offer it. The club did not require confessions to be worthy. They tested with tasks, an initial hour sweeping shards of glass and clumps of dirt until his hands learned the rhythm of the broom, a trial sorting box after box of bolts and washers until his fingers found their way by feel, a long patience of carrying trays while people ate and watched the small boy not ask for more than was given. When Tina from the diner slid a brown paper bag across the counter, scrambled eggs cramped into a takeout container, a half-wrapped sandwich, a thermos of coffee for the men, she nudged it toward Noah with her knowing smile. "Eat up," she told him. "You look like you've been through a winter."
Noah ate with his head down, the plastic fork clattering like small punctuation. He was practiced at being small. He said thank you, which was the one thing his mother had insisted on when she taught him manners. When he finished, he folded the napkin and put it back in the bag, as if even the trash needed to be tidy. Keller, whose patience lived in ledger lines and a steady pen, made a note in his pocketbook, not an indulgent note, but a record. Date, name if one could be coaxed, tasks assigned. Later he would turn that note into something else, a small paper trail, because the world that saved a kid sometimes required careful paper. On the loft, a thin cot awaited him that first night, dragged from under a stack of tires and laid out with a blanket Moose Joe had brought from the back of his pickup. It was a patchwork rescue, not a promise of permanence, but of immediate safety. Noah lay on his back and watched the rafters. He listened to boots scuff and muffled laughter. The bruise throbbed, but the roof was dry and the blanket smelled faintly of diesel and home. They tested him again the next morning. Lucky took him under the hood of a 1969 Chevy with a patience that was both exacting and kind. He taught the boy how to hand him a socket without waiting to be told, how to wipe a rag clean against the proper direction. "Tools are honest," Lucky said. "You treat them right, they do what you ask. You don't treat them right, they'll bite your fingers off." Noah laughed once, a startled sound, like a bird rediscovering a branch. Slow things mattered more than grand gestures. When the boy learned to tighten a bolt just enough so it would keep, Lucky's face softened. When Noah offered to stay late and sweep the bay floor again without complaint, Keller marked it in the ledger. Presence, reliability. The clutch of small, regular favors turned into the seconds and minutes that add up to a life. A toolbox arrived one afternoon, dented but cleaned, a hand-me-down from an older brother or a customer who owed the garage a favor. Keller found a plumber's name label and stuck it on the top, but Moose Joe pulled out a Sharpie and wrote Noah in block letters. Tina sewed a patch on the inside of his jacket sleeve so the name wouldn't wash away. It was not much. It was everything. With the toolbox came rituals. Noah took to writing lists on scraps of paper and tucking them into the box's lid. Sweet Bay, sort bolts by size, learn how to change a tire. He left a photograph in there, a Polaroid Tina had taken of him leaning against a workbench with a grease smudge on his cheek. A picture that would eventually live on a corkboard with other scraps, dates, notes, and the thin thread that became a log. The men gave him jobs that required him to learn to be steady. They offered no platitudes about family. They were careful about language. Kid was a category. Family was earned. They watched him as they watched tools. For wear, for signs of strain.
They made it clear, through tone, through tiny acts, that he was there by choice, and that choice would be respected. Weeks passed. The bruise on Noah's cheek faded into a darker remnant, and then into a pale scar, but new marks sometimes showed up. A quick black under the eye, a tender line along his forearm, and they were less easy to dismiss as accidents. Once, while Noah was tightening a bolt, he flinched when someone slammed a door in the alley outside. Lucky looked up. His face became a map that read concern. He called a pause in the work, slid a Polaroid out of his pocket, and clicked a picture of Noah's face with the light from the bay as a backdrop. They did not gossip, they documented. Keller crossed the date into his book. Tina, who had always been more social than the men, took a matchbook and wrote the day and a short description with her waitress hand. She stuck the matchbook into her apron pocket until she could peel it out and put it with the Polaroids. Moose Joe placed a hand on Noah's shoulder and asked him quietly, "You all right, kid?" Noah said, "I'm fine." He had learned the cadence, official words for the public self. He had a private language too, the one his hands spoke when they were working, but those soft sentences were not for strangers. The club organized a system that didn't look like bureaucracy, but functioned like one. Barker and Razor, loud enough to be noticed but steady enough to step in at a pinch, rotated duties of watch. When they saw the boy flinch, they wrote it down on a sheet meant for parts counts but adapted for people. Evidence lived in unlikely places, a grease-stained napkin with a date, a photograph tucked into a muttering ledger, a receipt from Tina's diner with a time and description. Their aim was simple. If a kid comes to us, we keep him safe, and if we suspect harm, we do not rely on hearsay, we collect facts. One rainy Tuesday, after the club had clocked 3 separate incidents of fresh marks in as many weeks, Lucky made a move that felt almost like an inevitability. He walked across the dim street to Tina's and put a Polaroid on the counter, a close-up of a swelling by Noah's ear, time-stamped by the phone's date imprint. "Put this in the bag," he told her. "Tomorrow, when Clive shows up, I want a copy." Clive Henderson was the foster parent assigned to Noah's file. He came with a car that smelled of cologne and a clipboard thick with forms. He had brought Noah to the system at some point that year, and in paperwork existed as the adult who would provide a home. The bikers had met Clive once at a county meeting and had a sense of the man from that encounter, polished, direct, a man who used words with tight edges. When he arrived at the garage one morning asking for Noah, the air shifted. "You don't understand me," Clive said, voice smooth with the civilities of an authority that believed in its own correctness. "He is my responsibility. He needs to come home."
Moose Joe came forward, not aggressive but immovable. "We don't take people off the street for show, Clive. He stays because we let him stay, and because he works and earns his keep." Clive smiled the way an attorney smiles when a cross-examination begins. "Legally, you cannot hold him. He is placed with me by the agency. You can't just keep him." Keller held his ledger as if it were a shield. "He's here by his own asking," he said, voice small but steady. "If you want him, you can show us a paper that says otherwise." Clive's expression hardened. He reached for some law in his pocket, a passage to pull the boy away. He didn't raise his voice. Clive didn't need to. Intimidation isn't always loud. The bikers did not move to make him leave. That would have been theater, amateur and dangerous. Instead, Barker and Razor flanked the garage doors with their presence, making it clear the room was on notice. Lucky kept a hand near his phone. Moose Joe spoke into the space between them in a way that asked Clive to step back. "If there's paperwork, bring it. If there's a problem, we'll talk it out. But if you come here and you try to make him go, we're calling who we need to call." Clive's jaw clenched. He left, saying he would take the matter up with the agency. The threat hovered like a smell, formal power on the way. Moose Joe watched the taillights until they disappeared. He closed the door, pulled the shutters, and put another Polaroid on the corkboard. The board was becoming a map. Strings connected Polaroids to notes to receipts. It looked less like a conspiracy and more like a file. Each item there was a fact to be taken seriously if the time came. The men had seen enough to know the law was not quick. It required patience, proof, and sometimes the patience the system lacked. Melina, the CPS social worker the club reached out to, came with a bag of professional steadiness and a sympathy that refused to be sentimental. She asked to see Noah alone, and the men gave her space without making it feel like abandonment. She sat across from him at a long table in a county office, with the light of the hallway slipping in beneath the door. Noah answered her questions with the same economy he'd used at the clubhouse. He talked about the work he did, about sweeping and sorting, about the toolbox with his name. He spoke about going to sleep on the loft cot and about learning to change a tire. And then, because the space allowed it and because Melina waited without prying, he said the one sentence that meant more than any list of tasks: "I don't want to go back to Clive's." The words landed like a plea and a verdict. Melina took notes with the speed of someone who keeps paper tight against memory's tendency to blur. She asked gentle, clarifying questions. Had he been hurt at Clive's? Did he feel unsafe? Noah blinked and said without drama, "They hurt me. Here I get to work and be treated like someone."
Melina's face shifted from professional neutrality to something steadier and more serious. She explained, plainly and kindly, what the next steps could be: a welfare check, a potential removal if evidence supported it, the option of seeking an emergency hearing. There would be forms, statements, time. The law was a tool and a test, she told him. Sometimes it protected, sometimes it moved too slow. But we'll start what we can, she said. Back at the garage, the men orchestrated their own small, legal-minded campaign. They were not the authorities, but they were witnesses. Lucky printed out a list of dates and observations. Keller copied down his ledger notes and organized them into a clean sequence. Tina added the receipt copies and the Polaroids she'd taken when Noah first arrived. Moose Joe wrote a letter, a simple statement of what he had seen and what he could offer in support: a home, a roof, the loft cot, the steady work. They were collecting not vengeance, but documentation. It is the odd truth that to protect sometimes requires paper the way a hand requires a glove. It gives the hold a better fit. Then Clive reappeared, this time not alone, but with a county badge tucked inside a jacket and an air that implied he'd been talking to people who advised him to be firmer. He asked again for Noah, and the garage filled once more with the quiet hum that precedes escalation. Moose Joe met him at the door with a voice like an old plow. "You got paperwork?" Clive balanced himself like a man explaining the world to someone who'd lost a map. "He belongs with his foster parent. You can't interfere with placement." Moose Joe didn't argue the law, he argued the boy's voice. "He says he don't want to go back," he told Clive. "Melina's coming to look into it." Clive bristled. "Then you let the agency handle it. You don't harbor a child who's placed through the system." Keller slid a photograph, the one with the bruise and the timestamp, across the counter. "This is in there now," he said. "We give it to Melina. We make a record." Clive looked at the photo and then at Noah, who stood at the back of the room near the roll-up door, fingers curled into the pockets of his jacket. He did not beg. He met Clive's eye for the first time and said softly, "I'm not going." The room was quiet enough to hear the radiator ticking. Clive's face hardened in a way that suggested the adult world was gearing up to do what the adult world does. He walked toward the door and left a threat in his wake. He would take legal steps. Outside, in the alley, a neighbor had watched the exchange. She had seen the boy come in weeks before and had started leaving socks on the front steps of the garage when she could. She tapped a note on the window and slipped another pair of shoes into the toolbox lid when she came by with a casserole. Small acts, they called them, sometimes embarrassed by their size, but they added up into a kind of safety net. Melina filed the intake that day. In plain language, she wrote down the observations, the statements, the Polaroids, the receipts, and the men who would be witnesses. The law had procedures: welfare check, written statements, potential petition for an emergency hearing if immediate removal was necessary. That petition required that the child be at imminent risk of harm if left where he was presently placed. Melina did not hope for a dramatic courtroom victory. She hoped for the slow, methodical response that matched the facts the men had collected. The men met afterward in the quiet of the garage, windows clouded with the afternoon fog settling over the city. They passed a small paper among themselves, a list of who could testify, who had a camera, who had time to go to hearings if it came to that. None of them fancied themselves heroes. Lucky joked with Barker about who would make the driveway coffee, and the joke landed with a relief that tasted like something between a laugh and a prayer. Noah sat on the lip of the toolbox and listened. He had not wanted to be the center of anything beyond the work, but being given a place to earn had given him a place to be believed, and belief made trouble into something that could be fought on paper and in public rooms. He touched the writing on the lid of the box, his name dry under his fingertips. The act of naming had been small but decisive. Names make things real. Names make claims.
He had claimed a toolbox, and in doing so had claimed more than a box. He had begun to claim a future where his hands could be skilled instead of used. When night fell, the garage hummed with the same low life it had before. Engines cooling, chairs settling into hours. But something was different. There was a readiness in the air. The men had taken a child's bruises and turned them into something that could be weighed. That was the first step toward protection. Translate suspicion into evidence. They were careful with what they knew. They did not collect stories to feed a hunger for drama. They collected the small, hard things that mattered in courtrooms and agencies: dates, photos, witness names, the consistency of attendance. The boy's repeated choice to work, to arrive early, to stay late, was a kind of testimony in its own right. It said who he was in the simplest terms, someone who wanted to be counted. Noah still kept to himself in some ways. He had rituals that walled him off at night, repairing a loose hinge on a toolbox, folding his clothes with a care that suggested he thought of them as tools, not just garments. When a new kid wandered by the lot and asked if there was a place to sleep, Noah found himself answering with instructions instead of stories. He showed the boy where the spare blanket lived. He did not offer him a finish line, only a task. Moose Joe watched him do it and saw the arc of something new, a kid teaching a kid how to be useful.
It was small, but then life is often repaired in small stitches. The worry remained, thick and patient. The system moves at its own pace. Clive's threat had made the issue time-sensitive. Melina phoned twice within the next week to check for additional evidence. Keller added dates. Tina mailed copies of register receipts. Lucky printed another set of photographs that showed marks in different places over the span of weeks. Each item readied the possibility of an emergency hearing that could grant temporary custody to someone able to prove immediate safety for Noah. There were practical decisions, too. If the agency moved quickly, the men discussed who could take Noah temporarily if needed. No one wanted to be a headline. They wanted to be a safe address. Moose Joe, with a voice that had the calm of someone who slept easily and had built his life of slow commitments, asked the question almost as an aside. If it comes down to it, would you want to be placed here, kid? Noah looked at the loft, at the patchwork blanket, at the toolbox with his name on it, and then at the men who had taught him how to hand a wrench. Yes, he said, not a plea, a statement, a choice. Of all the things they could do, the men did the one thing that saved more than violence. They chose to document and to invite the legal system in, rather than take the law into their own hands. That choice kept them honest and kept the child safe in ways that were both humble and powerful. They would attend hearings if needed. They would provide witness statements. They would not become judge, jury, and executioner. The law would have its role, awkward and slow though it might be. The first official letter came like a small thunderclap. Melina's intake note had been filed, and she recommended an emergency hearing based on the pattern of bruising, the child's statements, and the risk of immediate harm if he were to return. It was not a final verdict. It was a request, a measured legal plea for a judge to consider the facts and take temporary action if necessary. Clive read the notice and responded with his own counsel. He argued placement statutes and parental delegations and the obligations he'd fulfilled on paper. The exchange was clinical, the kind of back and forth that makes headlines less likely and court minutes more likely. Inside the garage, the tension hummed in the hands of men who were used to mechanical calculations and not the nuances of family law. They prepared, the way they prepared for a job: lists, backups, the care of knowing what to expect. Keller added copies of receipts. Lucky burned clean discs of photo files. Tina slid a cake into an insulated box that she swore she'd delivered to the loft the day the hearing might go in Noah's favor. It was both practical and human. A cake we'll have if we can. Noah watched all this like someone witnessing a map get drawn over his life.
He understood the stakes in the way a young person understands, simplified, acute, and close. He continued to show up. He swept, he sorted, and between jobs he taught a younger boy how to thread a wire. Each act was small, but stacked together they rose into a scaffolding that might hold him. The night before Melina said she would file the petition, Noah sat on the bench outside Keller's office and labeled a small metal plate with his name to screw inside the toolbox. He pressed the label until the letters were neat and right. Noah Collins. He read it out loud, like a promise to himself. Noah Collins. Keller heard him and smiled. "You ever think you'll want more than this?" he asked. Noah turned the plate in his hand. "Not yet," he said. "This is where I am right now." Keller nodded. That answer was honest and good enough for him. It told a story of a kid who could say what he needed, and who could also say when he wasn't ready to explain everything. The next day, Clive returned to the garage with a different posture. He had been advised to be careful in public. He had not been told to be kind. He asked to speak to Noah in the alley. The men listened to the conversation through an open window. Noah stood with his hands folded, the bruise a faint crescent under his hair. Clive's words were practiced and slick. He promised a nicer placement, a school program, more stability. He offered photographs of a prepared home. Noah listened.
When Clive finished, Noah said, quietly, "You can file papers, you can say whatever you need to, but I don't want to go." That line, simple, brave, and uncluttered, left the alley in a silence that had nothing sniggering in it. Clive folded his hands and left without more words. The club watched him go with a kind of tired, protective attention. Melina filed the petition that evening. The filing was not a hammer, but a request to the court to consider immediate protection. It meant papers passed between people in offices and a judge's calendar that could be moved. It meant the legal system was awake to the facts the men had assembled: photographs, witness statements, attendance logs, and a child's clear preference. The garage hummed with a brownout of quiet energies. Men made calls to family members who might testify. Tina baked one of her large cinnamon cakes and wrapped it with a napkin that already smelled like hope. Barker and Razor cleaned the bay with an almost obsessive care, as if double scrubbing could make things right. No one believed in miracles, they believed in diligence. Noah went to bed that night with a toolbox under his cot and the Polaroids pinned to the inside of the lid. The photographs looked back like a ledger of his living, a visual oath that someone had noticed and recorded. He slept in a way that was less like being swept away by exhaustion and more like being held down long enough to catch his breath. Outside, the city moved on. People in apartments argued about small things.
A dog barked. The next day, a note from the county said the judge would review the emergency petition first thing the following morning. People who have worked in garages for years know that timing can be both a friend and a foe. The men gathered, not because they expected to change a decision with their presence alone, but because being there made clear to anyone watching that the child had a village. Noah clutched his toolbox like a small prospectus for a life that had not yet been decided. He had asked weeks ago for work and had received it as a way of being treated like someone. Now, as the paperwork moved through a world that required names and dates and human witnesses, he realized his choice to come in through that door had started a sequence that might, if the system did its job, keep him from being returned to harm. The question of whether the law would move quickly enough hung over everyone like a cloud waiting to break. They had done what they could, collected facts, sworn statements, meals, a place to sleep. They had not broken laws, they had not threatened. They had kept to the gritty, necessary work of documentation and care. As they settled into the late-night hush, Moose Joe sat on a crate and looked at the boy, who was building something from spare metal and a wire he found in the bin. "You ever think about what you'll do when you grow up, kid?" Moose Joe asked. Noah flicked his eyes up, a small, exact movement. "Fix things," he said. "People too." Moose Joe laughed softly. "Start small with engines," he said. "People are harder." Noah smiled, that brief thing that makes a face look younger. Under the loft's dim, he taped the last of the notices into the corkboard. Dates, a calendar page, a note from Melina that she would be in court. It read like a map for a cross-country trip. Short legs, careful planning, the necessity of good company. They were ready as they could be. The men had done what their hands knew how to do: hold, record, and show up. The rest would be played out in rooms with wood paneling and gavel rhythms, in a process that could not be rushed without losing its purpose. Noah closed the toolbox and slid a blanket over his legs. The bruise where his jaw met his ear had faded to a memory that tugged in the cold. He felt something small and new, the sense that a series of small acts, a meal, a place to sleep, a logbook filled with dates, might gather into a shape that could be recognized by a judge as proof enough to keep him safe a little longer. He slept with his hand on the metal lid, as if holding the name affixed there could steady him against the uncertainty of the next day. Outside, in the dark, a car drove past and the tires hissed on wet asphalt. Inside, the garage's lights buzzed and a radio hummed to itself in the corner. The world was awake and waiting, and somewhere ahead of them, the courthouse clock clicked.
The morning the hearing opened, the courthouse smelled like polished wood and coffee. Men in suits moved with the slow efficiency of people who had memorized rules and calendars. The bikers arrived in patched jackets and work boots, a small, deliberate weather in the courtroom's clean climate. They sat together in the second row, the weight of presence rather than speech. Lucky kept his hands folded on his knees. Keller held a thin stack of copies, edges neat as if he had been preparing them for years. Moose Joe breathed steady enough that someone might have thought him a pillar made of habit and patience. Tina curled the edge of her napkin in her clasped hands, like a woman trying to keep herself small so the room could be quiet. Noah walked in with Melina at his side. He wore his name like he had learned to button it on. Simple, right, not loud. His cheek was pale where the bruise had been. His hair had been combed the way someone taught him to stand when adults watched. He scanned the gallery and found, in the second row, the toolbox with his name, propped on the floor beneath Morjo's chair, as if it were a small person given a spot to sit. The sight steadied him. The judge took a minute to sort his papers and let the room come into order.
Emergency hearings are, by design, brief and focused. Their job is not to settle every contested truth, but to decide if a child needs a temporary sheltering order while deeper inquiries proceed. The judge, a woman whose voice carried neither scorn nor excess sentiment, asked everyone to state appearances and then leaned forward. Melina explained the intake succinctly. Dates, photographs, witness statements, the child's own words. She did not dramatize. She said what had been collected, how the pattern of marks and the child's reported fear led her to recommend immediate protective measures. She requested that the court consider granting temporary custody to an adult who could provide a safe, stable residence while the agency completed its investigation. Clive's attorney read placement statutes into the record and argued the legal presumption that a foster placement, when arranged through the agency, is the child's legal living situation unless sufficiently contested and proved unsafe. He spoke in a cadence practice to hold the judge's attention. The agency had documentation, the placement was current, and any change required clear, substantiated evidence of immediate risk. His voice was steady, but cracks appeared when he tried to make certainty where only questions remained. Keller stood when asked and spoke in the sort of sentences he kept in ledger books: dates, attendance, tasks performed. He described Noah's routine, the moments of watching, and the specific instances that had prompted photographs and notes. Lucky presented the photographs, time-stamped close-ups, that viewed together suggested more than a single accident.
Tina testified about the takeout receipts, the nights she had seen the boy come in with bruises, and the bag she kept with the Polaroid she had taken at Lucky's request. Barker and Razor, blunt and steady, testified to the rotations they kept and the dates when they had logged flinches, marks, or explanations that didn't align. No one in that room offered theatrics. They did not loudly accuse. They gave the court the small, meticulous things that courts weigh: documents, dates, names, a child's repeated statement that he did not want to return. Then the judge turned to Noah. The room tightened. Even the sound of chairs settling seemed to hold its breath. "Do you wish to speak to me, Noah?" the judge asked, low and clear. "I need to know how you feel about going back to Clive's house." Noah looked not at the gallery, not at Clive, but at the judge's hands resting on a stack of legal pads. He breathed once and said with the quiet authority he'd been practicing since the first day he swept the garage, "I don't want to go back. They hurt me. Here I work and people treat me like someone." The sentence landed in a way a ledger entry does: simple, factual, hard to erase. The judge asked one clarifying question about whether he had been threatened into saying it. Noah considered and said, "No, I choose." He had learned the power of choice in the garage: to accept work, to accept a cot, to accept a name written on metal. The courtroom heard it as more than preference. They heard it as an assertion of personhood. Clive rose and tried, in tightly measured words, to rebut the suggestion of imminent danger. He spoke of structure he'd provided, the attempts at stability, the record of being listed as a placement. He did not raise his voice. He did, however, bring up the legal default. Children in foster placements should remain under their assigned care unless the agency can prove otherwise with evidence of immediate risk. Melina answered with professional calm. "Our file documents repeated physical marks inconsistent with the explanations we've received," she said. "We have statements from witnesses who have observed patterns and consistent accounts of the child's fear. We are not seeking a permanent reassignment today, Your Honor. We're asking for temporary custody while we fully assess." The judge ruled in the space between legal caution and the child's spoken fear. She explained that a temporary guardianship order does not replace the agency's responsibilities, nor does it predetermine permanent arrangements. It gives the agency time to investigate while ensuring a child's immediate safety is prioritized. The judge, pausing as if to let everyone understand the weight of what she was about to do, granted temporary custody to Moose Joe for a limited period, with the agency continuing its investigation and with the requirement that the men be available to the court as witnesses.
She set a follow-up date and spoke about visitation schedules and the need to preserve the child's stability. There were no horns, no comic book droplet of triumph. There were handshakes that felt like a shared breath. Moose Joe folded his hands over the toolbox as if to anchor himself to what had been entrusted. Keller exhaled so long it was nearly audible. Lucky's jaw slackened. Tina wiped at her face with the back of her hand, then quickly folded it back into a smile that was almost contained.
It came with a pile of responsibilities, paperwork to sign, a background check that reminded the men how public participation in a child's life now came with formal scrutiny, and a schedule of visits and interviews. The men took it in with the pragmatic acceptance of people who fix things. They would do the work, and they'd learn the forms. The first night after the judge's order, they held a quiet dinner on a folding table under the garage lights. Tina had made the pie. Someone, Barker probably, brought a candle, and they set it by the toolbox. Noah sat at the head end, a position that felt both ridiculous and right. He had never known to expect birthdays or candles in the same room as engines. He blew the candle out and made a wish that was small and realistic, to learn to fix an alternator. It landed in the room and was accepted like a good order. Months crept forward in the slow climb of Stitch's healing. The agency's investigation found disparities in Clive's account and a pattern of bruising that could not be wholly accounted for as accidents. That finding did not immediately resolve the legal question of placement. Clive contested. He hired counsel who combed through records, argued compliance, and promised adjustments. The process was procedural and grinding. There were meetings and memos, and sometimes it felt as if the language of protection had been folded into the language of forms and missed its tenderness along the way. Meanwhile, in the garage, the small rituals of belonging accumulated into a kind of scaffolding. Keller taught Noah how to keep a log properly: date, task, hours. There was pride when Noah began to do it without being asked. He would mark mornings he came early, days he stayed late, and when a job ran over, he noted it down. He learned the accountability of paper. The log became an extension of his dignity, his presence documented not as a liability, but as a record of work. Lucky started a more structured apprenticeship with him. They worked on an old Ford for weeks, going through belts and bearings, with Noah learning to read the engine like a patient language. Lucky's mentoring was precise and gruff. He rewarded correct technique and corrected sloppy habits. He taught Noah how to stand so that his shoulders didn't lock, how to ask for the right tool by name, and how to write an estimate that didn't underline itself with apology. Noah learned not only to fix parts, but to count his work as something valuable. Schoolwork, too, became a quiet center. A tutor from the community center, an art teacher who'd seen the garage flyers, helped Noah with reading and with the paperwork that sometimes arrived from the agency. They made the agency letters into boxes he could unpack without fear. "The world loves a stack of papers," the tutor joked once, "so let's make sure yours are tidy." Neighbors continued their small ordered commitments. The woman who had left socks on steps now stopped by with a sweater in late autumn.
A man from the block who repaired bicycles promised to teach Noah how to wheel bearings in the winter. The garage had become an odd sort of public square, not one defined by loud protest, but by returning, reliably, with small kindnesses. There were rough days. A letter arrived suggesting a possible move for the agency's plan. It was met with a hurried call and an insistence that Noah not be moved while the hearing calendar spun. He had nights when the old reflexes of flinching at loud doors returned. Moose Joe had a way of sitting near him that did not demand conversation and gave space to let things settle. They took therapy appointments seriously, not as a final fix, but as another tool in a toolbox. Noah attended sessions with a counselor who taught him grounding techniques, focusing on breath, counting the rings of the toolbox, mapping where sounds came from. He practiced noticing trains and naming them in his head until the sound felt like part of a city's grammar rather than a threat. Evidence continued to matter. Keller kept copies of logs, Lucky rotated photo backups, Tina saved receipts. Even when it felt dull, they understood that law required the patient diligence of neat records and unexcited facts. The temporary guardianship gave time to gather context and to let things settle in a way that the agency could use to decide on longer-term arrangements. At school, Noah slowly earned a reputation beyond pity. He was the kid who could braid a metal wire and explain why it mattered. He participated in shop competitions and took apart an old lawnmower to get it running again. The teacher of the shop class once let him explain to the class how torque and patience were related. He spoke with an authority that surprised some and thrilled others. It was an odd kind of confidence, soft, built on competence rather than bravado. Time, though, is not a cure. It is a place where small acts accumulate and sometimes reweave what has been torn. Noah's body healed faster than the memory of fear, but in the slow afternoons, he found ways to mark the reclamation. He sanded the inside of his toolbox until the lid's metal warmed under his hands. He saved a small photograph of him leaning against the bench, grease smudged on his cheek, and tucked it into the box's lined top. He would touch the photo before starting a job, a ritual not unlike a prayer but practical and tactile. The men did not become saints.
They argued about bills, about who had the right wrench for a job, about whether someone should have left a light on in the loft. Lucky cursed at a stubborn bolt, and Barker forgot to be careful with a reserved customer. They were, importantly, human, rough, occasionally selfish, often loving in their own unpolished way. At one point, a social worker suggested supervised visits for Clive if an arrangement could be worked out that didn't endanger the child. The suggestion was weighed with care.
Melina, who had been thorough from the start, advocated for a plan that prioritized Noah's well-being and emotional readiness. The agency worked to arrange a plan that could, if Clive completed certain steps, and if subsequent assessments validated those steps, allow limited, supervised contact. The legal system gestures toward restoration when it can, but it does not rush it. The process sat like a ladder, a possibility contingent on consistent demonstrations of change. Months later, the court reconvened. The follow-up hearing advanced with many of the same actors, the men in their patched jackets, the caseworker with files tight in a folder, Clive's counsel with counterpoints prepared. The judge reviewed the agency's investigation, the files of photographs, the testimony of neighbors, and the logs of the garage. There were no theatrical reveals, no cinematic courtside justice. There were instead steady steps. The judge noted the pattern of evidence, Noah's consistent statement, the agency's recommendations for continued guardianship with periodic reviews, and she ordered a longer-term plan that would continue to prioritize the child's safety and his express needs. She set out review dates and outlined expectations for the foster parent and for any possible restorative steps. It was not an ending. It was a sustained, legally structured form of protection that recognized the work the men had done and the child's own choice. The town noticed in small ways. The story did not become national news, but at the diner people talked in a low, approving murmur about those bikers who had kept records and had been present. A neighbor told a friend at a church group, and the church decided to organize a donation drive for winter coats to be left at the garage for any child who might need them. The attention that did come was less about hero worship and more about an admixture of curiosity and relief that a messy human problem had been handled with enough care to keep a child safe. A year from the night he first walked through the rusted door, Noah stood on a back stoop outside the garage and taught a younger boy how to strip insulation from wire without nicking the copper. The younger boy watched with bright beginner eyes. Noah's hands moved sure and unhurried, the motions of someone who had learned from repetition. He explained in small sentences, "You hold it like this. You don't tug. You let the blade do the work." The toolbox at his feet was scuffed in places that told the story of use rather than neglect. Someone had sanded the nameplate until it shone. It had a new latch, tightened by his hand. He had added a small note card in the lid, dates of jobs done, a short list of bearings he'd replaced. The card was both practical and declarative. "Here is what I have done." Moose Joe watched from the doorway with a face that said more than his words ever would. Lucky came out with 2 iced coffees and handed one to Noah like a teacher passing a tool.
Keller tucked a new ledger into his bag and winked at Noah in a way that was almost invisible. Tina arrived with a slice of pie for the boys and set it down with a smile that said the world could have a pie sometimes and not holler about it. Barker and Razor moved in and out of the frame, checking parts, making small jokes about the younger boy's grip. The neighborhood had become a web of care, stitched almost entirely with small, consistent commitments. It wasn't systemized benevolence, it was an accumulation of ordinary people being dependable. They had translated suspicion into paperwork, meals into comfort, cots into rest, and work into dignity. Noah, showing the younger boy how to crimp a terminal, stopped and looked at the child's hands. "You got steady hands," he said. It was a compliment and a recognition. The younger boy beamed. "Like you," the boy replied. Noah smiled and then, with the simplicity of someone who had learned to allot language carefully, said, "You can do this. Just come every day." Slowly, almost by the accumulation of small days, Noah's life rewove itself. He passed tests in shop class and repaired the alternator he'd once wished for. He kept a list of the parts he changed, his ledger now partly his own. He went to the agency's review hearings and sat through them without flinching when names were read. He spoke when asked, measured in the same voice as he had used before the judge, practical, direct. Each time he spoke, it was as if the well-worn exercise of naming tasks and dates remade him into someone who had authority over his life. The system, for all its clumsy bureaucracy, did respond to evidence gathered with care. The agency continued to monitor, to plan, and to ask for periodic reviews. Clive participated under court conditions that required him to demonstrate change, counseling attendance, improved documentation of caregiving, and a supervised visitation plan if appropriate. Nothing about that process was guaranteed. It was instead a methodical set of steps meant to weigh risk against progress without collapsing either. Years later, the toolbox with his name would find its way into a small corner of a shop where Noah apprenticed formerly under Lucky. He would keep the photo Tina took pinned inside the lid, now faded at the edges like a page worn by being turned often. He would recall in the quiet moments between jobs the night he opened the rusted door and asked for work. He would remember the way the men had watched him with a rough attention, how they had documented and shown up, and how Melina had translated their facts into action. The town was not, in truth, shaken by a single act. It was shifted by a series of small, steady commitments: a woman leaving socks, a diner owner baking a cake, a ledger kept, a photograph snapped, a social worker filing a petition, a judge writing a temporary order, a man who took responsibility for feeding and housing without clamor.
Those acts together made a kind of safety net. They proved a truth that is simple and hard. Protecting a child is less an act of salvation than a practice of consistent, boring care. On warm, late evenings, in the months that followed, people sometimes saw Noah sitting on the bumper of an old pickup, teaching a younger kid a knot, or showing how to balance a wrench on a bolt slip. The toolbox sat open at his feet, a modest shrine of tools that meant something more than metal. It had become a symbol that could be read by anyone who had a sense for repair. A life could be mended, not by miracles or by solitary heroics, but by the steady application of tasks, and by people being there when the law and the community did the work together. If you feel moved by what they did and want to help in your own town, check the links in the description below to find local child welfare resources, volunteer opportunities, and organizations that support children in foster care. Small acts, repeated, are the most reliable way to keep a child safe. Noah taught the younger boy to thread a wire one last time as dusk settled and the garage lights flared a soft yellow. He showed him the grip, the careful angle, and then handed him the crimped terminal with an approving nod. The boy's hands were steady. Noah closed the toolbox gently, as if closing a book he intended to return to. He rested his palm on the nameplate for a beat, and then lifted it, walking back to the bench where Lucky waited with a rag in his hand and a wink in his eye. The town did not crown them, it simply kept the garage lit and the door open, a small, practical kindness that says, without words, that someone is there.